Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting into a quieter corner of medieval life. A place where candles guttered in the cold air, where someone's job was to cut off heads. And sometimes, they were really bad at it. So get comfortable, pull the blankets up, dim the lights. Because we're not rushing anywhere tonight. We're going to wander slowly through the oddly stressful world of the medieval executioner. And more specifically, what happened when he botched the one job he was supposed to get right. Now, executioners were not exactly beloved members of society. They were necessary, yes, respected, not really. They lived in this strange twilight of medieval social hierarchy. Everyone wanted them around, but nobody wanted to shake their hand. They handled corpses, they spilled blood, and in Christian Europe, that was basically like wearing a giant sign that said, "Don't invite me to your dinner party." And yet, the executioner held enormous symbolic power. One clean stroke of his axe could demonstrate royal authority. One messy swing, however, could cause murmurs of divine disapproval. If a king ordered someone's head cut off, and instead the condemned ended up looking like a butchered hog, that mark it well. The crowd might begin to wonder if God was unimpressed with the monarch's judgment. So what happened when the axe missed the mark? Well, let's drift gently into a few examples. Take the case of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587. Now yes, that's a little post-medieval, but it's too good to skip. She had been imprisoned for years by her cousin, Elizabeth I of England. Finally, after plots and conspiracies, and a great deal of royal sulking, Elizabeth signed her death warrant. Mary walked calmly into the execution chamber, dressed in black, as dignified as she could manage. She gave a little speech, as one did. And then, she laid her head on the block. The executioner swung his axe. He missed. Instead of severing her head cleanly, he lodged the blade into the back of her skull. Mary groaned. The crowd gasped. And the executioner had to raise the axe again, and again till finally her head came off. But even then, things got worse. Because when he lifted Mary's head to show the crowd, as tradition demanded, the hair came off in his hand. She had been wearing a wig. What he triumphantly displayed was a clump of auburn curls, while Mary's head, with thinning gray hair, rolled onto the floor. Not the best performance review for the poor executioner. Now, what kind of punishment would he face for that? It depended. Sometimes, nothing happened at all except humiliation. Other times, a botched beheading could ruin an executioner's reputation. In very rare cases, the crowd might even turn violent. Execution was, after all, a kind of grim theater. People came to watch. They wanted efficiency. They wanted drama, but not too much drama. A clean strike reassured them that justice was orderly. A messy, hacking disaster suggested incompetence. Or worse, it suggested that the condemned had divine protection, and that human justice was interfering where it shouldn't. And medieval people took omens seriously. Let's drift back a little earlier. To Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, executed. In 1541, she was 67 years old, and accused of treason against Henry VIII, which honestly, was Henry's favorite pastime, accusing people of treason. Now, Margaret did not go quietly. When told to place her head on the block, she refused. She claimed she was no traitor, and she wouldn't kneel for the axe. The executioner, already nervous, began to swing, and it was not good. It took at least 10 blows to finish her. Some accounts even say 11. By the end, she was hacked apart like a piece of firewood. The crowd was horrified. Not because they particularly loved Margaret, but because the executioner had made such a ghastly mess of things. And what happened to him? Well, according to some records, he was seen as incompetent, shamed for his inability to deliver a clean death. A few versions of the story even claim that he was punished afterward. Though in Tudor England, punishments for officials were more about politics than skill. If you failed in front of the wrong audience, you were in danger. Botched executions didn't just make the executioner look bad. They could reflect badly on the crown itself. Imagine being a king, declaring that God was on your side, only to have your chosen executioner flail around like an amateur lumberjack in front of thousands of your subjects. Not the best PR. Because of this, some executioners were punished directly. In parts of Germany and France, if an executioner missed, he might face a beating from the guards. Or, in an extra poetic touch, The condemned man might be pardoned if the executioner proved too incompetent. Essentially, sorry, you had your chance, better luck next time. Though rare, these pardons did happen, and you can imagine how awkward it must have been for the executioner, watching the man he just failed to kill walk away, alive. While the crowd jeered, executioners were also judged by speed. A single swing was best. 2 was tolerable. Anything more than 3, and people started whispering. Consider James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, executed in 1685 after leading a failed rebellion against King James II. The executioner, Jack Ketch, was infamous for his sloppy work, and during Monmouth's beheading, he lived up to his reputation. The first strike failed. The second wasn't much better. Monmouth reportedly struggled on the block while Ketch hacked at him repeatedly, needing at least 5 strokes to finish. The crowd was horrified, furious. They nearly rioted. Ketch had to run for his life. Later, Ketch wrote an apologetic pamphlet, blaming his nerves, which is not what you want to hear from the man swinging an axe at your neck. But let's slow down a bit. What was it actually like to be in that position? Imagine standing before a crowd, your hands sweaty on the axe handle. Everyone expects you to perform flawlessly. The condemned may be trembling, or screaming, or reciting prayers. You raise the blade, aim for the neck, and you know that if you miss, if the blade glances off bone, or strikes too high, or too low, you will be hated instantly by everyone watching. It was not an easy job. Executioners trained, of course, but not all were skilled. Sometimes, local butchers were called in to do the work, which explains a lot, really. And when they failed, the punishment was not always official. Sometimes, it was social. Crowds mocked them. Ballads were sung about their incompetence. Their names became synonymous with clumsiness. In a society where reputation was everything, this could sting more than any fine or beating. So what punishments did executioners face if they botched a beheading? The short answer: humiliation, sometimes physical violence, occasionally loss of their job, and in rare cases, death. The long answer is the one we've been drifting through tonight. A messy business, wrapped up in politics, religion, and the uneasy theater of public justice. Executioners lived in a fragile balance. Too cruel, and they were hated. Too soft, and they were mocked. Too clumsy, and they risked everything. And yet, without them, kings and queens would have struggled to enforce their will. They were both despised and necessary, which, if you think about it, describes much of medieval governance in general. And with that thought, let's drift onward. We've seen what happens when the axe slips. Let's move toward the next royal mishap, where the bloodlines themselves begin to wobble. Because up next, we'll be wandering into the lives of the most inbred monarchs in European history. Tonight, as we drift deeper into history, we find ourselves in the company of kings and queens who spent far too much time marrying their cousins. Royal bloodlines were supposed to be precious, like rare wine that only grew finer if you kept it within the family. Unfortunately, this belief had the same effect as leaving a bottle uncorked in the sun. Generations of carefully arranged cousin marriages led to strange results: fragile heirs, and rulers who were about as sturdy as damp parchment. Royal families believed they were protecting their dynasties by keeping outsiders away. The Spanish Habsburgs were particularly devoted to this idea. They treated family trees less like branches and more like circles, folding them back on themselves again and again until it became difficult to tell where one ancestor ended and the next began. If you look at their genealogy, it is less a tree and more a tangled knot. The most famous result of this was Charles II of Spain, often called the Bewitched. He ruled in the 17th century and remains one of the most striking examples of what generations of cousin marriage can achieve. Charles was physically weak, struggled to chew food properly, and did not learn to walk until he was 4 years old. He had a famously protruding jaw, which historians politely call the Habsburg jaw. Less politely, it meant he could not close his mouth entirely, and sometimes drooled in public, which is not ideal when you are trying to appear majestic. He was sterile, mentally fragile, and chronically ill. In his lifetime, courtiers often whispered that his very existence was proof that divine punishment had fallen on the dynasty. Charles's lineage showed exactly why inbreeding was a terrible idea. His mother was the niece of his father. His grandparents were all related in some way. By the time of his birth, more than half of his genetic inheritance came from the same small group of people. Shuffled and reshuffled, like a worn deck of cards, he was, in many ways, less a new monarch and more the fading echo of his ancestors. The Habsburg obsession with keeping bloodlines pure stemmed from politics. They believed that marriage alliances between branches of the same family kept crowns, titles, and wealth tightly bound together. A daughter married to a cousin meant land remained in the dynasty rather than being shared with outsiders. In practice, it also meant that genetic disorders, deformities, and fragility became family traditions as well. Charles II was not the only victim. Earlier Habsburgs had shown warning signs. Philip IV of Spain, Charles's father, was married to his own niece. Before that, generations of Habsburg princes had displayed unusually large jaws and poor fertility. It was almost as if the dynasty was trying to prove a point about heredity by providing living examples of its dangers. If we leave Spain and drift toward Austria, we find similar stories. The Austrian Habsburgs were every bit as determined to keep it in the family. Emperors and archdukes alike married their cousins, convinced that no one outside the dynasty was worthy of them. The result was a series of heirs who often looked alike, behaved alike, and unfortunately died alike young and frequently unfit for rule. The idea of dynastic purity was not unique to the Habsburgs. The Egyptian pharaohs had taken it even further. Centuries earlier, brother married sister, and children were often the offspring of such unions. In their world, keeping the bloodline divine mattered more than biology. The Ptolemies, the ruling family of Cleopatra, followed this practice closely. Cleopatra herself was likely the product of sibling marriage. Yet, unlike Charles of Spain, she seemed to inherit her share of political cunning and charm. One might call her one of the few lucky survivors of dynastic inbreeding in medieval and early modern Europe. The problem grew because monarchs were obsessed with making alliances. A cousin in France was still preferable to a stranger in Germany. A niece in Portugal was a safer match than the daughter of some unpredictable duke. The irony was that in trying to strengthen their lines, they quietly weakened them. Kings who could barely chew heirs who could not produce children, and dynasties that ended not with a bang but with a sickly whimper were the unintended consequences. Returning to Charles II of Spain, his reign became almost symbolic. He lived to the age of 39, but every year was filled with illness and superstition. Courtiers attempted exorcisms, believing that his strange ailments were the work of witches. Priests muttered prayers, while doctors tried every possible cure, from bleeding to bizarre potions. None of it helped. Charles died childless, and with him, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty died too. Centuries of cousin marriages ended not with a proud heir, but with a monarch so weak he could barely rule his own body. The end of the Habsburg line threw Europe into crisis. Wars erupted over who would inherit Spain. Ironically, all the effort to keep the dynasty pure only ensured that it collapsed in confusion. A few noble families squabbled over the scraps, and the carefully guarded bloodline vanished into history. If Charles II is the tragic face of inbreeding, then the broader Habsburg family is the comedy. Portraits of Habsburg rulers often show enormous chins, so long and heavy that they seem to weigh down the entire face. Artists tried to flatter their subjects, yet even the most generous brush could not disguise jaws that looked more suited to a cartoon than to a crown. It is one of history's great ironies that the family most obsessed with appearances ended up remembered for their unflattering genetics. And so, when we think about dynastic oddities, the Habsburgs are the perfect bedtime example. They remind us that power is fragile, that the human body does not obey politics, and that marrying your niece is, to put it gently, unwise. They also provide endless entertainment to historians, who find in their portraits and genealogies a strange blend of comedy and tragedy. As we let the candles burn lower in this story, it is time to drift toward another side of royal life. We have seen what happens when bloodlines are folded too tightly. Next, we will explore what happened when royal marriages themselves went wrong. Not because of genetics, but because the people involved were every bit as petty and dysfunctional as any modern couple, only with crowns on their heads. Royal marriages were rarely about love. They were about borders, treaties, and the delicate balancing act of keeping crowns in the family. When kings and queens married, they married for power. Yet beneath the glittering ceremonies and painted portraits were real people who often disliked one another intensely. They were forced into unions they had not chosen, and sometimes those unions fell apart in spectacular ways. One of the most famous examples comes from England. Henry VIII, whose name has become almost synonymous with unhappy marriages, offers a gallery of disasters. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had been married to his brother before him. When his brother died young, Catherine was married to Henry in order to preserve the alliance with Spain. At first, they seemed to live harmoniously, but the years passed without a healthy male heir. Catherine gave birth to children, but most did not survive. Only one daughter, Mary, lived. For Henry, this was not enough. He began to brood on whether his marriage was cursed. He convinced himself that marrying his brother's widow had angered God. Conveniently, this also allowed him to justify pursuing another woman. That woman was Anne Boleyn. She was witty, lively, and ambitious. Henry became obsessed with her. He pushed aside Catherine, seeking to annul the marriage. The Pope refused, which led Henry to break from Rome entirely. An entire church was created, in part because one man wanted a new wife. Yet when Anne finally became queen, she quickly learned that Henry's passion was fickle. She produced only a daughter, the future Elizabeth I, and soon lost his affection. Accusations of adultery and treason followed. In the end, Anne was executed by the very system Henry had created. For a marriage that had changed the face of English religion, it ended in blood and humiliation. Henry's later marriages fared no better. Jane Seymour gave him a son, but died soon after childbirth. Anne of Cleves was chosen from abroad, but Henry found her appearance disappointing. He referred to her as a Flanders mare, which was not the most romantic nickname a bride has ever received. Their marriage was annulled after only a few months. Catherine Howard, young and lively, was accused of unfaithfulness and executed. Finally, Catherine Parr survived him, but only by outliving him. Each of these marriages reveals not only Henry's volatility, but also the grim reality of royal unions. They were less about companionship and more about producing heirs and projecting power. Love rarely entered into it, and when it did, it was dangerous. Across the Channel, in France, similar stories unfolded. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are remembered as symbols of extravagance, but their marriage began awkwardly. Louis was shy and hesitant. For years, the marriage went unconsummated, which became the subject of gossip across Europe. Courtiers whispered, pamphlets circulated, and the reputation of the monarchy weakened. When the couple finally did produce children, the damage was already done. Their inability to present a strong and fertile image of kingship fueled criticism. That helped ignite the French Revolution. Their marriage was not built on affection, but on alliance between France and Austria. And it placed two young people in a spotlight so harsh it eventually destroyed them. Another tragic example comes from Russia. Tsar Peter III married Catherine, later known as Catherine the Great. The union was arranged when they were still teenagers. Peter was immature, fond of playing with toy soldiers, and often cruel in his treatment of his wife. Catherine, intelligent and ambitious, endured years of neglect and humiliation. Eventually, she staged a coup, overthrowing her husband with the help of her allies. Peter was soon dead, under mysterious circumstances. Catherine emerged as one of Russia's most powerful rulers. But her rise was born from a marriage so disastrous that she had little choice but to replace her husband entirely. Royal marriages also suffered when cultural differences clashed. One telling example is Philip II of Spain and Mary I of England. Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, married Philip in the hope of strengthening Catholicism in England. Philip, however, was unpopular with the English. He was viewed as a foreign interloper, a Spaniard with little care for his new kingdom. The marriage produced no children, and Mary became increasingly desperate. She suffered multiple false pregnancies, where her body swelled and symptoms appeared, but no baby arrived. The public grew restless, and Mary became known as Bloody Mary for her harsh religious persecutions. Her marriage to Philip left her isolated and unhappy, while Philip spent little time in England at all. When she died childless, the crown passed to Elizabeth I, and the union that was meant to secure Catholic strength in England became another tale of failure. If we step into the world of Portugal, we find King Afonso VI, who married Marie of Savoy in 1666. Afonso was partially paralyzed, mentally unstable, and incapable of ruling effectively. The marriage was never consummated, and Marie Francoise soon sought an annulment. She married Afonso's brother instead, a move that embarrassed the king and left him sidelined for the rest of his life. It was a reminder that not every royal groom was capable of fulfilling even the basic expectations of marriage. These unions remind us that royal lives, for all their wealth and splendor, were often filled with personal misery. The idea of marrying for love was a luxury reserved for the lower classes. For monarchs, marriage was duty, strategy, and performance. When those marriages collapsed, the consequences were rarely private. Entire kingdoms watched, whispered, and sometimes rebelled. As the candles of these stories flicker lower, the lesson is clear. Royal marriages were not fairy tales. They were contracts written in flesh and sealed with crowns. When they failed publicly, and they often dragged nations down with them. Now, let us drift onward. We have wandered through the frailty of bloodlines and the misery of marriages. Next, we will turn toward the smallest and most revealing details. We will look at the strange habits and petty meltdowns of rulers who believed themselves above the world, only to reveal just how human they truly were. Royalty often imagined themselves as larger than life. They sat on thrones, wore crowns of gold, and declared themselves chosen by God. Yet, when we look closely, many of them behaved in ways that were far from majestic. Their personal quarrels, jealous fits, and petty habits often undermined their power. Some seemed less like rulers of nations, and more like characters in a family drama that happened to cost thousands of lives. Let us begin with King Charles VI of France. Remembered by history as Charles the Mad, he came to the throne in the late 14th century, with high hopes placed upon him. For a while, he ruled competently, but then his mind began to unravel. At times he believed he was made of glass, and he ordered his attendants to wrap him carefully so that he would not. Shattered at other times, he wandered the palace halls, forgetting his name or refusing to recognize his wife and children. Court life adjusted awkwardly to his delusions. Servants followed him closely in case he broke into violent fits, while nobles schemed in the shadows, taking advantage of his instability. France suffered as rival factions used the king's fragile state for their own gain. What should have been a reign of strength dissolved into whispers and paranoia, all because the king could not trust his own mind. England produced its fair share of dysfunction as well. Henry VI was another king plagued by mental breakdowns. At one point, he lapsed into a catatonic state, unable to speak or even acknowledge the birth of his own son. The kingdom was thrown into chaos, with competing nobles rushing to fill the vacuum. The Wars of the Roses, that long and bloody conflict, were fueled in part by Henry's weakness. It is striking to think that the fate of armies and dynasties hinged on a man who sometimes sat silently, staring at the wall, unable to recognize his own crown. Petty behavior was not always the result of madness. Sometimes it was simple pride. King Louis XIV of France, the famous Sun King, demanded absolute attention at all times. Courtiers were required to watch him eat, to hand him his shirt in the morning, even to hold his candle as he walked to bed. Every small act became a performance designed to display his majesty. If a nobleman failed to appear at the right time or neglected to flatter him properly, he was frozen out of favor. Behind the glitter of Versailles was a world of endless petty rivalries, where a badly timed bow could ruin a career. Louis understood this perfectly and enjoyed watching his courtiers squirm. It was politics as theater, and he was both actor and director. Sometimes, the pettiness was less elegant. Peter the Great of Russia, for instance, was brilliant in many ways, dragging his country toward modernization. Yet he also had a violent temper and a taste for humiliating those around him. He once forced nobles to drink enormous quantities of alcohol in staged drinking contests, laughing as they collapsed. He demanded that long-bearded men shave to match his vision of modern style, and those who refused had their beards cut off by force. His reforms reshaped Russia, but they also revealed a ruler whose vision was carried out with the subtlety of a tavern brawl. Royal pettiness often turned inward into family drama. Queen Isabella II of Spain quarreled endlessly with her husband. Rumors swirled that many of her children were fathered by other men. Court life became a battlefield of gossip and scandal, where personal grudges shaped national policy. The throne looked less like a seat of dignity and more like a stage for domestic squabbles. In Denmark, Christian VII offered another version of dysfunction. He preferred games, drinking, and juvenile pranks to the duties of a king. He was easily manipulated by courtiers, and his marriage to Caroline Matilda of Great Britain fell apart almost immediately. The queen entered into an affair with the king's physician, which eventually led to her exile. The king remained on the throne, but his reign was marked by instability and humiliation. Denmark, caught between reform and collapse, was led by a monarch who treated governance as little more than a nuisance. There is also the story of Emperor Rudolf II of the Holy Roman Empire. He collected exotic animals, strange artifacts, and unusual curiosities, but neglected the pressing matters of his empire. He became reclusive, suspicious, and prone to erratic behavior. Courtiers found themselves waiting for decisions that never came. Wars brewed outside his walls, but inside he preferred to brood over alchemical experiments. The empire slowly slipped into decline, while the emperor fussed over pet lions and impossible dreams of turning lead into gold. When we look at these rulers together, a pattern emerges. Royal power did not always produce wisdom. In fact, the isolation of the throne often encouraged the worst instincts. With no one to correct them, monarchs indulged their pride, their fears, and their whims. Petty grudges could last for years, shaping foreign policy. Dysfunctional families produced wars. Personal tempers created national crises. The crown magnified ordinary human flaws into consequences that shook entire kingdoms. And so we find ourselves drifting through the dim halls of history, watching kings and queens throw tantrums, wander in madness, or cling to ritual like children afraid of the dark. Their pettiness and dysfunction remind us that behind the crowns and titles, they were simply people. The difference was that their mistakes became the mistakes of nations. As the candles burn low on these stories, we turn toward a quieter corner of royal life. Not the marriages, not the wars, not even the crowns. Next, we will drift into the nurseries and sick rooms to see what it was like to be a royal child. These were the heirs meant to carry dynasties forward, yet so many of them began their lives weak, spoiled, or overshadowed by expectations too heavy for their small shoulders. When we think of kings and queens, we often picture them seated on thrones, issuing commands with sweeping gestures. In reality, much of their lives was filled not with grandeur, but with routines that were oddly ordinary, or, in many cases, deeply peculiar. A monarch's day might begin with ceremonies that were as much theater as hygiene. It was not unusual for a royal's morning routine to include being washed and dressed in front of an audience. Privacy was rare. In France, the lever, or royal waking ceremony, was a formal event. Courtiers gathered to watch the king sit up in bed, have his shirt placed upon him, and drink a little broth. What could have been an intimate moment became a stage for power, with nobles jockeying for the privilege of handing him a sleeve or holding his basin. Of course, this meant that personal habits became political. Who was allowed to approach the king in the morning determined who had influence. For Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, these rituals were a tool of control. He used his own body as a theater of state. Yet the irony was that while the court admired his regal gestures, they were also observing his more human struggles. His gout, his frequent constipation, and his occasional bad temper were all performed before an audience. Majesty was inseparable. From bodily inconvenience, monarchs often developed strange habits in response to the pressures of their roles. Charles V, the Habsburg emperor, was famous for his odd eating habits. He consumed vast quantities of food, often washing it down with enormous draughts of beer. His jaw, already deformed by generations of inbreeding, made chewing difficult. Meals could be slow, messy affairs. Courtiers whispered about the emperor's difficulties, yet they also had to copy his manners. If he ate heavily, others followed suit. Thus the habits of one man shaped the digestion of an entire court. Sleeping arrangements were no less peculiar. Many monarchs were plagued by insomnia, whether from illness, stress, or superstition. Philip II of Spain, ruler of a vast empire, often rose in the middle of the night to pray in his private chapel. His routine was as much about soothing his anxious mind as it was about piety. Others turned their beds into political spaces. The bedchamber was not just for rest, but for audiences. Ambassadors, nobles, and courtiers sometimes conducted business at the bedside of half-wake kings, who nodded along, trying to look regal while propped up on pillows. Cleanliness, too, was a matter of custom rather than science. In much of medieval and early modern Europe, bathing was viewed with suspicion. Doctors warned that warm water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter. Monarchs followed these recommendations, which meant that many of them avoided full baths. Instead, they relied on linen shirts, frequently changed, to wick away dirt and sweat. This created an illusion of cleanliness, though it did little for the odor. Perfumes and scented gloves were popular solutions. Courtiers, sometimes, remarked more politely on the fragrance of a room than on the state of its ruler. We might also consider the habits of monarchs at table. Dining was not only nourishment, but performance. Forks, for example, were slow to catch on in much of Europe. Some rulers resisted them stubbornly, preferring to use their fingers long after utensils had become common. Henry VIII enjoyed eating with his hands, relishing the physicality of it, even as courtiers tried to imitate him. Banquets could last for hours, with dozens of courses paraded in, many more admired than eaten. The king's ability to consume was itself a kind of strength on display. Superstition wove its way into daily routines as well. Monarchs often carried charms or followed rituals to ward off illness and misfortune. Elizabeth I of England surrounded herself with astrologers and alchemists. She did not always believe their predictions, but she enjoyed the reassurance they provided. The Habsburgs relied on relics, surrounding themselves with fragments of saints and holy bones to protect their health. A royal day was not complete without a little whispered magic, woven into the fabric of prayer and ceremony. Pets and animals played roles in royal routines too. Many rulers were deeply attached to their dogs, parrots, or more exotic companions. Catherine the Great adored her Italian greyhounds, who shared her chambers and distracted her from the burdens of empire. Kings of France often kept hunting dogs by their side, even at formal meals. Animals softened the loneliness of monarchy, offering companionship that courtiers could not. Yet they also created absurdities, as when ambassadors found themselves bowing to yapping dogs sprawled across a royal lap. Some rulers, anxious by nature, clung to peculiar daily practices. Frederick William I of Prussia rose early each day to inspect his soldiers. He was obsessed with military order, even in private life. His children were terrified of him, his courtiers exhausted by his endless drills. Yet to him, routine was safety. By contrast, his son Frederick the Great would later embrace music and philosophy. Rising late and spending hours in leisurely pursuits, the pendulum of royal habit often swung from strict discipline to indulgent idleness within a single generation. There were also habits born from medical conditions. George III of Britain, famous for his bouts of mental illness, developed patterns of talking incessantly during his manic phases. Courtiers grew accustomed to the king pacing the rooms at night, muttering prayers and fragments of conversation. His habits reflected not only his struggles, but also the patience of those forced to endure them. The daily lives of monarchs were shaped as much by sickness as by power. Even travel followed strange rhythms. Monarchs rarely stayed in one place for long. Courts moved constantly, partly to display majesty, partly to avoid the stench of their own kitchens and drains. The French court might move from palace to palace in restless cycles, with hundreds of servants packing and unpacking. These movements were exhausting, but they were also a form of habit. A wandering court was simply how a king lived, carrying his kingdom with him like a snail with a gilded shell. When we step back, the picture of royal habit is both majestic and faintly ridiculous. Their days were filled with rituals that elevated the ordinary into the extraordinary. Eating became a ceremony, waking up became a spectacle, and sleep became a council chamber. Yet beneath the glitter, they were still human beings with indigestion, sleepless nights, and anxious routines. The habits of monarchs remind us that power magnifies the ordinary. What we do in private, they did in public, and what we consider quirks became traditions of state. As the night drifts deeper, we can leave behind the strange routines of kings and queens. Ahead lies another corner of history worth exploring. Let us move gently into the lives of those whose reigns were not marked by strength, but by weakness. Some rulers were fragile, not in body, but in character. Their reigns were shaped less by habit and more by pettiness, insecurity, and dysfunction. It is to those peculiar monarchs, tangled in their own tempers and rivalries, that we now turn. History often praises rulers who conquered, reformed, or built empires. Yet just as often, it remembers those who stumbled through their reigns, burdened not by great wars but by personal flaws. Power did not always magnify greatness. Sometimes, it magnified insecurity, vanity, or simply poor judgment. These monarchs remind us that dynasties could be as fragile as the people who led them. Take, for example, Charles VI of France, remembered as Charles the Mad. He began his reign with promise, a young king admired for his energy and charm. Yet as time passed, he fell into bouts of madness that left his court bewildered. There were days when he believed he was made of glass, convinced that any touch would shatter him. He demanded that iron rods be sewn into his clothing to protect his fragile body. Courtiers tiptoed around him, afraid that even a gentle brush of a sleeve might send him into panic. France, already struggling with war and factionalism, found itself led by a man who could not trust the solidity of his own limbs. His reign became a patchwork of regencies and power struggles, while he drifted in and out of delusion. Then there was Christian, the Seventh of Denmark. His reign was a lesson in how dysfunction at the top could unravel an entire court. He was known for wild behavior, often leaping about in public, striking people without warning, and laughing at inappropriate times. Diplomats recorded their discomfort at being received by a monarch who could not sit still or speak coherently. He indulged in compulsive habits, from obsessive hand-washing to constant self-gratification, which embarrassed those forced to serve him. Eventually, power slipped from his hands into those of his physician and ministers, who ruled in his name while he retreated further into instability. The Danish court became a stage where everyone acted their part, while the king himself stumbled behind the curtain. Pettiness could be as damaging as madness. James, one of England, though an intelligent man with a love of books, displayed a remarkable tendency for small grievances. He detested being called by the wrong title, bristled at any perceived insult, and showered favorites with affection while alienating others through neglect. His court was a place of endless quarrels, often sparked by trivial matters such as hunting privileges or seating arrangements. He was convinced of his divine wisdom, yet relied heavily on favorites who exploited his trust. What could have been a stable reign often felt like a family squabble, magnified to national importance. Some rulers allowed jealousy to poison their reigns. Peter III of Russia, husband of the future Catherine the Great, seemed more concerned with toy soldiers than with the affairs of his empire. He idolized the Prussian King Frederick the Great and dressed his troops in Prussian uniforms, much to the annoyance of his own officers. His pettiness extended to his personal life. He quarreled endlessly with Catherine, neglected his duties, and alienated the nobility. His reign was short, for Catherine, tired of his ineptitude, seized power in a coup. His dysfunction made her strength shine all the brighter, though it also underscored how thin the line between power and powerlessness could be. Even rulers considered great were not free of pettiness. Napoleon, though not a monarch in the traditional sense, indulged in endless sulking when courtiers failed to flatter him sufficiently. He scolded officers for minor slights, obsessed over his appearance, and grew furious when painters or sculptors captured him at the wrong angle. The emperor, who commanded armies across Europe, also fretted over portraits. Tantrums that echoed the small insecurities of any man. Though magnified by his throne, royal pettiness could also emerge in family life. The Spanish Habsburgs were particularly prone to quarrels within their own households. Philip IV resented the popularity of his own son and heir, fearing that affection for the young prince undermined his authority. Mothers and fathers who should have nurtured heirs, instead, regarded them as rivals. Courts became suffocating, with whispered rumors and jealous glances replacing affection. The dysfunction of royal families often mirrored the dysfunction of their dynasties, as marriages forged for power produced children burdened by suspicion and resentment. One cannot forget the case of George IV of Britain, a monarch whose vanity and indulgence were legendary. He lavished money on clothes, jewels, and banquets, even as his people grumbled about the cost. He quarreled bitterly with his wife, Caroline of Brunswick, turning their marriage into a public scandal. His attempts to divorce her became a national spectacle, complete with pamphlets, accusations, and street protests. Rather than ruling with dignity, he became a figure of ridicule, mocked in caricatures as bloated and overdressed. His dysfunction was not only personal but also public, dragging the crown into disrepute at times. Dysfunction was simply a matter of weakness. Louis XVI of France was not mad, nor petty in the traditional sense, but indecisive to a fault. He wanted to please everyone, which meant he pleased no one. Faced with crisis, he hesitated, delayed, and consulted endlessly. His inability to act decisively during the French Revolution sealed his fate. The dysfunction of his reign was not in outbursts or scandals, but in silence and hesitation. Sometimes, weakness can be as damaging as madness or vanity. What unites these monarchs is the way their flaws became magnified by their positions. A petty man in private life can be ignored. A dysfunctional relative can be avoided. But when that man or relative is the ruler of a kingdom, his insecurities ripple outward, shaping policies, alliances, and even wars. The quirks of monarchs became the burdens of nations. As we drift further into their world, it is worth remembering how fragile power truly was. Thrones rested not only on armies or laws, but on the personalities of those who occupied them. A single jealous glance, a foolish habit, or a fit of madness could alter the course of history. Dysfunction was not the exception in royal households. More often, it was the rule. Now, with the candlelight burning low, let us leave behind the petty quarrels of monarchs and step quietly into another chamber of history. Ahead lies the question of royal childhoods, where the seeds of dysfunction were often planted early. The nursery, the tutor's lessons, and the endless weight of expectation shaped rulers long before they sat on their thrones. It is to those fragile beginnings that we now turn. The childhood of a king or queen was never truly their own. From the moment they entered the world, they were not simply children. They were heirs, symbols, bargaining pieces, and political investments. Their cradles were gilded, their clothing trimmed with costly fabrics, yet they often grew up in loneliness, suspicion, and rigid control. Behind the walls of palaces, royal nurseries could be as cold as dungeons. Consider the young Louis XIV of France, who would later call himself the Sun King. He grew up during the chaos of the Fronde, a series of rebellions against royal authority. As a child, he was awakened at night and rushed from his bed as mobs stormed near the palace. He never forgot the terror of seeing angry faces outside his window. From then on, he associated safety with absolute power. His childhood fear hardened into the belief that the crown could not be shared, questioned, or weakened. The man who built Versailles, surrounding himself with endless ritual and ceremony, was once a frightened boy who clutched his mother's hand in the dark dot in Spain. The Habsburgs raised children who were both precious and tragically fragile. Charles II, often called Charles the Bewitched, was the product of generations of inbreeding. His childhood was marked by illness and disability. He did not speak clearly until he was 4, could not walk properly until he was 8, and was constantly attended by physicians who whispered grim reports. Instead of carefree play, his days were spent under watchful eyes, treated more like a specimen than a child. Courtiers debated his health in public, while his mother clung to the hope that he could still carry the dynasty forward. His nursery was filled not with laughter, but with silence and dread. The story of Mary, Queen of Scots, is another reminder of how little freedom royal children possessed. She became queen when she was only 6 days old. From the moment she could crawl, she was treated not as a girl, but as a crown on legs. She was sent to France at the age of 5, to be raised at the French court, betrothed to a prince she barely knew. Her childhood became a parade of lessons, etiquette, and expectations. Though she grew up surrounded by luxury, she belonged to others long before she belonged to herself. Even her games were rehearsals for diplomacy. Dolls were replaced by dancing masters, and her smile was considered a political tool. Royal nurseries were also full of rivalries. Henry VIII's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, experienced this firsthand. Mary was declared illegitimate when her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was set aside. Elizabeth later suffered the same fate when Anne Boleyn fell from favor. As children, they were stripped of titles, shuffled from one household to another, and told that their very existence was conditional. Imagine being a child and learning that your right to call yourself a princess could vanish overnight. Such instability shaped both of them. Mary grew into a woman marked by deep insecurity and bitterness. Elizabeth learned caution, calculation, and the art of survival. Their childhoods, defined by their father's whims, wrote the script for their adult reigns. Even children who seemed pampered often lived under suffocating expectations. The Dauphins of France, heirs to the throne, were raised in an environment so rigid that they were rarely allowed to show ordinary emotions. Tutors controlled their words, gestures, and even facial expressions. If a prince frowned, it was noted. If he laughed too loudly, it was corrected. The child who might have wanted to climb a tree or chase a dog instead sat stiffly in lessons about Latin, scripture, and etiquette. The crown did not wait for them to grow into it. It pressed down on them from the cradle. Sometimes, the weight of childhood was not in lessons, but in isolation. Ivan the Terrible of Russia grew up surrounded by cruelty. After his father died, Boyars fought for control of the young prince. He witnessed beatings, murders, and betrayals before he was even old enough to rule. Lonely and afraid, he turned to small acts of violence himself, throwing animals from towers and watching them suffer. The boy who grew up with mistrust in his heart became the man whose name is still synonymous with terror. His childhood did not soften him. It hardened him into iron. For some royal children, the danger came not from enemies outside, but from their own families. Byzantine princes were often blinded or mutilated by relatives who feared they might one day claim the throne. A child might grow up knowing that their very existence put them in peril. Brothers who might have been playmates became threats. Mothers schemed, fathers suspected, and uncles plotted. Innocence was rarely possible in such a world. Even in less violent courts, royal children were seldom free of suspicion. Every illness, every stumble, every moment of weakness was magnified. The survival of dynasties depended on their bodies. A cough could bring whispers of doom. A limp could invite ridicule. Tutors and physicians hovered constantly, reporting not only on studies, but on the state of the heir's complexion, digestion, and appetite. Childhood was transformed into a series of examinations. What is striking is how often these unusual childhoods shaped the rulers they became. The boy who was awakened by mobs became the king who demanded absolute obedience. The girl declared. Illegitimate grew into the queen, who ruled with iron caution. The child coddled in isolation became the adult, unable to cope with reality. Palaces raised children, but they rarely raised them well. As we linger on these images, it becomes clear that royal nurseries were not havens of innocence. They were training grounds, prisons, and sometimes even battlefields. Behind the silken cradles and golden rattles lay lives marked by fear, control, and expectation. The laughter of royal children was seldom carefree. It was muffled, watched, and weighed for what it might mean to the future of a crown. And so, as the fire in the hearth burns lower, we leave behind the world of royal childhoods. Ahead, we will drift into another chamber of history. One filled with the strange rituals, odd superstitions, and daily habits that ruled the lives of kings and queens. Even in their smallest gestures, rulers revealed the strange mix of grandeur and absurdity that defined them. Royalty liked to present themselves as extraordinary, almost divine. Yet when we look closely at the daily rituals that filled their lives, we often see something far stranger. Some of their habits were meant to display power, others were born from superstition, and many were simply the result of centuries of tradition repeated until no one dared question them. Their mornings, meals, and evenings were rarely private. Even the smallest acts, such as waking up or brushing teeth, were wrapped in layers of ceremony. Take Louis XIV, once again. The French king who turned the routines of his body into a theater of power. His mornings began with the lever, the ritual. Rising nobles crowded into his chamber to watch him wake. Some were permitted the honor of handing him his shirt. Others were allowed to slip his shoes onto his feet. The king's body was treated as a stage where courtiers competed for a role. Imagine opening your eyes each morning to find a room full of eager aristocrats standing at your bedside. For Louis, this constant presence was not annoying, but carefully cultivated. By turning his daily routine into ceremony, he reminded everyone that access to his person was a privilege. In contrast, in England, the Tudors and Stuarts developed their own peculiar traditions. Court life revolved around food, and yet monarchs often ate very little in public. Banquets were stages, not meals. The monarch would take a few symbolic bites while everyone else stared. Elizabeth I was known for nibbling more than eating, keeping her appetite controlled, as though even hunger had to obey her command. Meanwhile, the kitchens churned out mountains of meat, pies, and puddings. The smell of roasting flesh filled the halls, but the queen herself often seemed uninterested. Eating in front of others was an act of performance, not pleasure. Cleanliness was another matter that revealed royal strangeness. Bathing was viewed with suspicion in much of medieval Europe. Many monarchs believed that water opened the pores and allowed sickness to creep in. Henry IV of France was said to have bathed only a few times in his life. He relied on perfumes instead, filling his presence with overwhelming clouds of scent. Elizabeth I also disliked bathing, preferring linen shirts that could be changed often to remove dirt. The court might look splendid, but it often smelled less than regal. Personal hygiene was rarely a matter of comfort. It was tied to ideas of health, morality, and even class. Superstition often guided royal habits. Many rulers consulted astrologers before making decisions. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, relied heavily on horoscopes to guide her timing. For events, her belief in the stars was not unusual. Courts throughout Europe employed astrologers who calculated auspicious days for marriages, battles, and coronations. A monarch might delay signing a treaty or mounting a horse because the heavens had not yet aligned. To modern eyes, it seems like folly, but to them, it was another tool to keep control over an unpredictable world. There were also odd medical routines. Charles II of England believed in the healing power of touching his subjects. He practiced the royal touch, laying his hands on people suffering from scrofula, a disease of the lymph nodes. Crowds lined up for the chance to be touched, convinced that the king carried divine healing. For Charles, it was both a duty and a performance, linking his body directly to sacred power. The ceremony was repeated thousands of times, even though the results were rarely convincing. What mattered was not the cure, but the display of mystical authority. Meals carried their own rituals beyond eating. In many courts, dishes were tasted by servants before being presented to the monarch. This was meant to guard against poison, a fear that haunted kings and queens for centuries. Some rulers went further. Ivan the Terrible kept entire squads of food tasters, while paranoid Byzantine emperors rotated their dishes constantly, ensuring no one could predict what they might eat. The act of dining became less about nourishment and more about survival. Each spoonful carried the weight of suspicion. Even sleep was surrounded by ritual. Monarchs rarely enjoyed solitude at night. Bedchambers were often filled with attendants, who prepared the royal body for rest. Curtains were drawn in solemn silence. Prayers were recited. Guards stationed outside the doors ensured no disturbance could reach the sleeping sovereign. Yet this constant supervision could be more suffocating than protective. A royal bedchamber was not a sanctuary. It was another stage, another place, where the crown was on display. Some habits were simply odd. Frederick William I of Prussia collected tall soldiers. He developed an obsession with creating a regiment of giants, searching all across Europe for men of unusual height. These soldiers were not meant for battle so much as for his personal amusement. He delighted in parading them before guests, as though their bodies were living trophies. In return, he treated them with indulgence, though their presence served no real purpose beyond satisfying his peculiar fascination. Meanwhile, Peter the Great of Russia found joy in disruption. He disliked the stiff traditions of the old Muscovite court and introduced habits that shocked his nobles. He forced them to shave their beards, drink heavily, and join him in mock ceremonies where roles were reversed. What to others might have seemed disorder was, to him, a way of breaking old patterns and stamping his authority on culture. His habits were both personal and political, reshaping Russia to his vision through the smallest of acts. For queens, rituals often focused on appearances. Elaborate dress was not merely fashion, but a form of propaganda. Elizabeth I spent hours being dressed each day, layers of gowns, jewels, and wigs assembled around her like armor. To appear in public without this full regalia would have been unthinkable. Her clothing was her power, a visual statement that she was both untouchable and eternal. Each habit of dress reinforced her position, even as it weighed heavily on her body. The most curious thing about these rituals and habits is how they blurred the line between necessity and theater. What should have been private became public. What should have been simple became complicated. Monarchs lived in a world where every gesture was charged with meaning. A bite of food, a sip of wine, a change of clothes, even the act of rising from bed carried layers of political symbolism. By repeating these habits, day after day, they kept their crowns secure. But they also trapped themselves in performances from which they could never step away. As the night deepens, we can see how royalty lived in constant ritual. Their habits were not simply quirks. They were strategies, protections, and illusions that maintained the fragile image of majesty. Behind the ceremonies, they remained human, but those humanity was hidden beneath endless repetition. Their lives were carefully staged, their bodies transformed into symbols. And so the rituals that seem strange to us now were once the very threads that held kingdoms together. Kings and queens lived surrounded by wealth, armies, and walls of stone, yet they were often prisoners of their own fears. Superstition wrapped itself around their daily choices. A crown might glitter brightly, but behind it stood a ruler who trembled at omens, portents, and invisible dangers. Their power made them targets for poison, curses, and betrayal, and so they leaned heavily on charms, rituals, and warnings to keep disaster away. One of the most enduring royal superstitions was the fear of comets. To ordinary people, comets were mysterious streaks of light across the sky. To monarchs, they were dreadful heralds. When Halley's comet appeared in 1066, it was seen as a sign of doom for Harold II of England. Later, when King Charles V of France saw a comet blazing overhead in the 14th century, he became so anxious that he refused to leave his palace for days. Comets did not care about human politics, but they terrified rulers who believed their crowns were balanced on cosmic scales. Another deep fear was illness brought by invisible forces. Monarchs often clung to strange protections. James I of England carried amulets and charms to ward off disease, despite also writing treatises against witchcraft. He was both fascinated and horrified by the unseen. Catherine de' Medici kept astrologers and soothsayers close, convinced they could shield her children from ill fortune. When predictions pleased her, she trusted them completely. When they were grim, she tried to bend events so that fate could be tricked. To a queen with so much power, superstition was both comfort and cage. Numbers also carried heavy meaning. Many monarchs avoided particular days for fear of disaster. Louis XI of France dreaded Fridays, especially the 13th, centuries before modern culture turned it into a superstition. He would refuse to sign documents or meet courtiers if the day felt ominous. Meanwhile, in Russia, Tsar Ivan the Terrible kept calendars of omens, convinced that certain days opened doors for calamity. These fears shaped decisions more than diplomacy ever did, showing how fragile even mighty rulers could be when trapped by their own beliefs. Dreams were another powerful source of anxiety. Monarchs often consulted interpreters, who claimed to unravel messages sent in sleep. Before the fall of Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI was said to have dreamed of losing his crown, and the story was later repeated as a warning of destiny fulfilled. Elizabeth of York, wife of Henry VII, dreamed of a dragon devouring her family's roses. Her visions spread whispers of doom among the court. In an age when few could explain the workings of the mind, dreams were treated as messages, written by fate itself. Some fears were practical, yet they grew into ritual. Poison haunted royal tables for centuries. Banquets were grand, but every dish was shadowed by suspicion. Tasters sampled food before it reached the monarch's lips. Silver goblets were preferred because they were believed to change color if poison was present. Catherine de' Medici was rumored, though perhaps unfairly, to carry hidden poison rings, feeding the fear that any cup or plate might conceal an assassin's plan. Monarchs sometimes avoided certain foods altogether, not from dislike, but because they had convinced themselves that fate might be hidden inside a piece of fruit. There was also fear of witches. Monarchs issued laws against them, burned them, and yet secretly worried that hexes might still reach them. James, I believed witches plotted against his very life, sending storms to sink his ship as he returned from Denmark with his new bride. His paranoia led to witch trials that claimed hundreds of lives, yet he still kept protective charms near his person. Even rulers who condemned superstition could not fully escape its grip. Fear of magic was stronger than royal decrees. Animals, too, were tied to omens. Black cats were despised by some monarchs as bearers of bad fortune. Birds flying through windows were taken as signs of approaching death. When Henry IV of France was assassinated in 1610, many claimed they had seen ominous birds circling the city days before. These stories spread quickly because they matched the fears already present in people's minds. Monarchs, for all their titles, listened to these whispers just as much as their subjects did. There were also personal superstitions. Napoleon Bonaparte, though later than the medieval world, carried a small packet of lucky charms, convinced they steadied his fortune. Charles VI of France feared sudden noises, believing they foretold danger. He also thought his body was made of fragile glass, a delusion that haunted him for years. His attendants had to pad his clothing so that he would not injure himself. What began as a superstition became a full madness, showing how royal fears could grow unchecked behind palace doors. Even death itself was framed in omens. Monarchs dreaded prophecies that predicted their final hour. When King Henry IV of England was told he would die in Jerusalem, he avoided travel, convinced the Holy Land spelled his end. Yet he collapsed instead in the Jerusalem chamber of Westminster Abbey, fulfilling the prophecy in an ironic twist. Such stories fed the belief that fate always finds a way, no matter how many precautions were taken. What we see in these superstitions is not simply foolishness, but vulnerability. Rulers had armies, castles, and crowns, yet they remained frightened of shadows, stars, and whispers. Their fears shaped their reigns just as much as their policies. Decisions that changed the course of kingdoms were sometimes made not in council chambers but in the quiet moment when a king glimpsed a comet or a queen recalled a troubling dream. Power gave them control over others, but superstition reminded them of how little control they truly had over the mysteries of life. And so, as we rest with these stories, it becomes clear that monarchs were never free from fear. They lived in constant tension, balanced between the glitter of authority and the dark pull of superstition. The crown could not shield them from omens. The throne could not silence the sound of an owl in the night. Their crowns were heavy, not only with gold, but with the invisible weight of imagined curses.